As more and more companies get hacked or experience data breach, you might be wondering if it's stressful to be working in cybersecurity. I mean, you are in charge of maintaining and securing your company. Not you alone specifically, but your entire team. But what happens when things don't go to plan? What happens when an incident response fails? So that's the topic of this video. Let's talk about what the experience of working in cybersecurity is really like, especially with the recent data breaches and outages and so on, and what actually happens when the cybersecurity team fails to mitigate the issue. So let's dial the clock back to 2022. If you're an Australian, you most likely remember a major telecommunications data breach with Optus in September. This data breach affected up to 10 million customers. To put this in perspective, that's more than a third of Australia's population. The damage? Millions of stolen information like passport and driver's license. I personally had to replace my own driver's license at the time, so it was pretty bad. Immediately the next month in October, Medibank experienced another data breach. More passport and sensitive medical data was stolen. Jump forward to 2024 in January, we've got our own government falling to the data breach. AnyDesk in February, Telstra in April, Qantas in May. In fact, if we take a look at this list of data breaches in Australia for this year alone, that's like 100 reported cyber attacks already, and we're only halfway through the year. So given the fact that companies are constantly exposed to cyber attacks, it makes sense that the field of cybersecurity is a high stress environment, right? Well, on a daily basis, the answer is usually no. To give you guys an idea of my normal, no major incidents, no drama, no BS kind of day, it usually starts with me going through emails first thing in the morning, then catching up with any reported phishing emails, followed by checking up on any pending help desk tickets, so stuff like resolving account issues, manual investigations, resolving escalations. Then I have my coffee break and move on to some chill development work. Some days I like to switch out the dev work to resolving vulnerabilities, depending on what the workload is like for the team. And that's usually it, just a normal 9 to 5 kind of day. But with the increasing number of cyber incidents happening not just in Australia, but across the entire world, we have been ramping up on our overall security posture. So that means lots of new projects with onboarding new security solutions, lots of research, lots of testings. Things have been really busy for us. So with that said, can I say that it's stressful now? Sure, on some days. I'd be lying if I said working in cybersecurity is easy and chill all the time. But isn't that the same with most white-collar jobs anyway? There's always that 90% of the time where it's peace and quiet, and then 10% of the time it's when things go wrong. Now when shit really hits the fan like the CrowdStrike audits recently, that's when the stress level shoots up. When you're experiencing this kind of incident, expect overtime. If it's a Friday night and you're in charge of restoring servers, there goes your weekends. I was so glad that server restoration didn't fall under my area of responsibility. I was able to happily enjoy most of my weekend. But what about incidents where a user or a system has been compromised? I'm gonna run through an example incident here, so feel free to pause at each step and really have a think about what you would do at each step. Let's say Bob is a developer in our company who was working on a project using AWS. One of the requirements that Bob needed was to create an API for clients to access and retrieve data. Bob completed all of his tasks and signed off the project. Now fast forward half a year later, the security operations team received an alert from AWS that a suspicious API activity has been detected. If you were the first person to notice this detection, what do you do? The most obvious first step is to determine if this API usage activity is expected. That means we need to verify who is using it. The first major clue would be thinking why a detection would happen now instead of the last couple of months. This would most likely indicate that there was an out of the ordinary activity which triggered an AWS alert. For those that don't know, AWS has a service called Guard Duty, which is basically like a security guard which monitors all the activities across all of your AWS environments and resources. And when we receive an alert such as this API detection from Guard Duty, we will see details like what kind of resources were accessed through the API, what user was used for this action, the source IP address and location for this user, and so on. Okay, going back to the alert, assume that we have now checked the relevant user and found out that it's from Bob, but the corresponding IP address is from an external source. After running a background check on this IP, we can confirm that this is not Bob's usual IP address. Now, what's next? You would be correct to say that we need to block this IP address on our firewall as soon as possible to prevent further compromise. So let's assume we've blocked this IP address off. What do we do now? If we think about the steps in an incident response, the first step is detection and analysis, which we've already done. The next step is investigation and containment. We've already conducted a partial containment at the root source, which is blocking the IP address. So here's the question. What else do we need to check? This question is really important and it really tests your understanding of the relationship between security systems. I would say if you're able to logically think through this question, then this separates you from the tier 1 SOC analysts. Alright, let's have a think about the facts that we have right now. We know that Bob created an API half a year ago, and this detection shows that Bob is using the same API from a different IP address. So I will first ask myself these questions. Can we confirm if Bob's account has been compromised? And are there also other users potentially compromised as well? Let's tackle the first point. How do we find out if Bob's account has been compromised? When you're working in a company, users are onboarded through Active Directory. This means we need to go through our Active Directory logs and look for signs of suspicious authentications. So stuff like logging into an account during out of office hours, authentication source that matches the IP address, authenticating to other applications, and performing bulk actions. Once we have clear evidence of compromise, we need to lock the account and change the password right away. Assuming that Bob's account has been compromised, we need to confirm if this is an isolated incident. We need to check if any other users were compromised as well. This means we need to go through more logs on Active Directory and check for any other users with authentication source that matches with the IP address. On top of that, we also need to check if there are any other users with IP addresses that are not usually theirs. Okay, let's say that we didn't find anyone else affected. This means it's an isolated incident. We've already further contained the situation by changing the user's password. Now we need to understand the severity of the compromise. This means we need to investigate if there are any outbound traffic which may indicate data exfiltration. So let's go back to Bob. We know that he would have basic access like emails, maybe shared file systems like SharePoint, or even specific databases. This means we need to check the logs for any traces of that IP address or any other suspicious IP addresses in our systems which perform actions like forwarding and downloading emails, downloading files on SharePoint, performing SQL queries on any databases. Let's imagine you stumbled on an event log which indicated that the IP address accessed a database and extracted PII data. So stuff like contact details, home addresses, licenses. What happens next? This will be an escalation to other teams when it comes to data that has already been exfiltrated. Most likely there will be an emergency meeting with the upper management to decide on the best plan of action for this. But as a SOC analyst, our job isn't over yet. We still need to investigate on how the compromise happened in the first place. The most common method of compromise in an organization is through social engineering, and that's most commonly done through phishing emails. If we dissect how a phishing email generally works, they will always have a phishing website link which could have been obscured behind an image or hidden within a hyperlink. This means we need to go through our email security system and website security system to see if Bob clicked on any malicious email links. Let's say we found out that Bob actually clicked on a phishing website from an email, and that prompted him to enter his login details on a phishing website. So who's at fault? Most people would think that it would be Bob's fault for not being vigilant enough for these kind of emails. That's true, but ultimately it will fall under the cybersecurity team. This is because we're responsible for the company's security and systems. Even though we know that realistically it's almost impossible to prevent 100% of the phishing emails, it still falls under our area of responsibility. In this particular scenario, since the damage is so big on the organization, there is a good chance that we will probably need to drop the email security provider and look for a better solution. So now that we've reached the end of the scenario, if you haven't caught on already, this is very similar to the Optus data breach that I mentioned earlier, except the issue was a public API that allowed the breach. The result of this breach cost Optus up to $1.5 million in fines. This is one of the many examples where an incident response actually fails. The damage couldn't be contained, and that resulted in huge losses not just in money, but also the trust for customers. Now that we understand how an incident response could fail, how can we prevent this? I have to say, if given enough time, all companies will be hacked at some point. Threat actors are always constantly looking for vulnerabilities and openings, and the cybersecurity team can only do what they can to try and stay one step ahead. I think the more effective way to tackle this problem is to accept that it will happen. Kinda like Murphy's Law, you know? Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So the best way is to have a plan for when things do go wrong, so there's a structured process for everyone, not just the cybersecurity team, so we can work together and minimize the impact. Anyway, leave a comment down below if you guys experienced a bad incident response and how you guys handled it. I think that's going to be interesting not just for me, but for everyone else to learn. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, thanks for watching.